So good afternoon and welcome to the ODI. I'm Joy Ladico. I am a writer and editor at the London Evening Standard newspaper. I'm also the founder of a club called Trouble, which is a pop-up club that pops up once or twice a year, which has women on stage talking about their expertise. And I'm very pleased to be here today as the chair of this incredibly high-level panel. The distinguished members of the high-level panel on women's economic empowerment, who've been tasked by the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon with providing leadership on how to close global economic gender gaps, are we have four representatives here today, who are going to enter into a conversation with those in the room and those on Twitter and in the outside world, and hopefully come up with some interesting, rather constructive ideas for them to take back to their panel. So a little bit of background. Some of these very broad points which you'd already expect. Gender inequalities in economic participation and the distribution of economic resources persist globally. Women remain disproportionately affected by poverty, discrimination and exploitation. Gender discrimination means women often end up in insecure, low-wage jobs and constitute a small minority of those in senior management positions. It curtails access to economic assets such as land and loans, and it limits participation in shaping economic and social policies. And because women perform the bulk of household and unpaid care work, their economic opportunities are limited. When they do work, their unpaid work in the home does not decrease, as recent ODI research shows. The realisation of these economic injustices and equality will be crucial to governments to achieve their Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, which have targets related to women's economic empowerment throughout. Earlier this year, as I mentioned earlier, Ban Ki-moon announced the women's first high-level panel on women's economic empowerment. Sorry, it's a little bit of a mouthful, with the aims of providing some leadership on this and how to close down this global economic gap. We have in it, there are leaders from the IMF, the World Bank, UN Women, economic experts, academics, trade union leaders, representatives of civil society and government. And they're all committed to identifying the most promising and workable and practical solutions to fast-track women's economic empowerment. The panel members are taking part in consultations around the world that will inform their first report due in September 2016, and I'm very much hoping some of the feedback will be coming from this room itself. So this isn't a conventional panel event. The panel members are here to listen to you, whether you're in the room or you're watching online or following on Twitter using hashtag #EmpowerWomen24_7. So in a while, I'm going to be calling on all of you to tell the panel members what you believe will make a real difference to women's empowerment and develop ideas with them. So I would like to introduce our four members. We have Fiza Farhan, who is the chief executive of the Bush Foundation in Pakistan, and she works on renewable energy and on women's economic empowerment and has beautifully meshed the two through, as we were talking earlier, in particular solar energy. We have Tina Fordham, who is managing director and chief global policy analyst at City Research, who's sitting at the far end here. Alicia Giron?
Yes,
Giron.
You're right.
Is professor at the Economic Research Institute of the National University of Mexico and is a feminist economist, a term that, in fact, I'd not come across before. And finally, we have the Right Honourable, well, actually, it's just a lack of economists, so it's just a very small subset. And finally, we have the Right Honourable Justin Greening MP, who's Secretary of State for International Development UK and a prime mover in this UN panel. Before I turn to them, I'm going to introduce Claire Melamud, who's the Managing Director of ODI, and she's going to give us a brief presentation which should set the stage for this.
Thank you very much, Joy. And on behalf of ODI, I'd like to first of all welcome you all to this consultation. We've been absolutely delighted over the last few weeks here to be working in close collaboration with the high-level panel secretariat and with the UK's Department for International Development on this critical issue. As we all know, all of us who work on gender and on women's rights, without economic freedoms, women's political and social freedoms will always be just part of the story. Getting change is always partly about evidence and mostly about politics. And as we've seen, I think this model, as we've seen many times on different issues over the last few years, this model of bringing together a panel which combines experience, knowledge, and critically political clout to focus on a specific issue It's a great way to focus minds and to start to bring change. So we are very hopeful of the work of the panel. And I am strongly suspecting that the fact that so many of you, we have an absolutely full house today, including standing room only, quite literally, have joined us in this room, and also several hundred watching online from many different countries, suggests that you too are hopeful about the work of this panel. So we thank you all. ODI's business is, of course, the development of evidence, defining problems and also suggesting solutions. Gender issues and the scandal of discrimination against women and girls has always been a core part of what we think about here in this building, and led so magnificently by Caroline Harper and her team. Most recently, we launched a flagship report on childcare. I think I recognise some familiar faces in the room from that event, which clearly highlighted the way in which women's responsibilities for care significantly limit their economic opportunities. And it's one of the things that I'm sure the panel will be returning to. Central to that report was choice, the choice of individual women and girls to lead the lives they want, and the removal of the barriers that constrain and limit those choices. And what I think is interesting here in the work of the panel is the way that we've come very much to choice, both from a women's rights perspective, but also, of course, choices, individual and social choices, are very much the core business of economics as well. Economics is built on an analysis of choice, individual choice, and choice under circumstances of constrained resources by individuals and by governments. And this is an interesting meeting point of those two ways of thinking. So as you deliberate amongst yourselves and you talk to the many academics, the civil society organisations, people in this room, the business leaders and the others who will all be giving you good advice, the one thing I would like to say today before we start this conversation is to please also keep in mind the views and experiences of the women themselves who are at the centre of this story. Women's lives and experiences are absolutely key to defining the priorities for change. Our research in the childcare report, for example, on childcare with women in India employed on tobacco farms showed how if women are asked, they often know exactly what's holding them back economically. In this case, when they were asked, the women in this particular village were absolutely clear that lack of childcare was restricting their economic opportunities. You see a quote from one of the women we talked to there. And as a consequence, the NGO, who was leading the focus groups, worked with the women to put pressure on employers to start childcare facilities for the women. So this policy is a small example of something which I think, writ large, suggests that policy change needs to come from the priorities of women themselves and from their own analysis of what they need, and also to reflect the reality, of course, of women's multifaceted lives and roles. Women, neither women nor men are simply economic agents. We're talking about complex social relationships and responsibilities. Of course, we can't, unfortunately, ask all women everywhere what they want. But there is a wealth of qualitative research and data from opinion polls which can shed a light on this critical piece of the jigsaw. The frustration with the lack of choice and the way that restricts women's lives, for example, comes out clearly in some data that we're working with at the moment from the Gallup World Poll, which is conducted in more than 160 countries, covers about 99% of the world's population. We're currently in the middle of analysing this data set, which has more than 1.5 million data points, so it's quite a job, but we're going to have more findings from this data available to shed some of the light on the issues we're talking about today in a few weeks. So globally, what we see from a very beginning, a sort of initial look at this data, is that the poorest women, not surprisingly, are less satisfied than richer women with their working lives. But among the poorest women, those who are working full-time are the most satisfied with their jobs, and women working part-time but who wanted full-time work, again, perhaps unsurprisingly, are the least satisfied. But this speaks to a general point that less choice for women over their working lives leads to less satisfaction with that aspect of their lives. And at the extremes, of course, making choices in situations where they have very few choices to earn an income can expose women and girls to risks of abuse and exploitation, as our research with girls in Ethiopia who migrated to work as maids has shown. And again, there's an extract from our report on that issue on front of you. So the urgency of increasing choice in itself justifies a focus on women's economic empowerment. And of course, we'll be hearing, I expect today, from some of the other economic, social, broader benefits that this kind of focus can bring. But of course, in some senses, we all know that. That's why a lot of us are here. The panel's job is to chart a way to get there. And I think one of the sort of key messages from the weight of ODI's research over the years is that if the panel's job is, in a sense, to write us a map towards women's economic empowerment, then women and girls need to be at your side helping to plot the course. So I hope that you will think big. We're not talking small-scale projects here. This is a hugely ambitious endeavour. Ambitious changes to legal and economic frameworks and social and gender norms which govern behaviour. And broad, this is not just about jobs or just about loans, but it's about all of the factors which limit choice and in the end limit women's well-being. And of course, we hope that you will keep the complicated, multifaceted lives, hopes and desires of real women and girls around the world right at the heart of what you do. So I'm hugely looking forward to this afternoon's discussion. If I may abuse my position for a moment and kick us off by just asking the panel a question, which you don't have to answer right now, whenever Joy says you can. I'd like to lead the panel members with just one question. So right now you're at the beginning of the process, doing a lot of consultations, thinking about the structure of the report. My question is, when you get to the end of this process, what's the one thing that you most hope that this panel will be remembered for? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire. And I'd now like to have the honour of welcoming the Right Honourable Justine Greening, Secretary of State for International Development, and she is one of the founding members of the high-level panel on women's economic empowerment. And she will be giving us a short speech.
Yes, just to really add my voice of welcome to everyone here today, especially my co-panellists, Fiza Vahan, Tina Fordham and Alicia Hiron as well. And of course you, Joy, thank you for being prepared to moderate today. It's much appreciated. And to ODI, of course, for hosting this and for all of the evidence-based research that you do that is helping to not only build the case for change, but also start to help us understand how we can deliver change as well. I really just wanted to make a few very quick points, really. I mean, the main question we have to ask ourselves today is if we're going to achieve women's economic empowerment, what is it going to take? So my sense is that we've seen progress in women's rights across the board, but it's been far too slow. And I gave a speech here earlier this year where I basically said I felt that we needed to really turbocharge that process. And there was a fantastic report by the World Economic Forum that looked at women's education, looked at participation and voice, women being able to be part of the politics around them, and their ability to be part of their economy. And it basically said if we improved at the same rate in the future as we have done in the past, it would take another 117 years until we got gender equality. Well, I certainly haven't got that long to wait. I don't know about any of the rest of you. So this panel is about how we take one part of that and really give it a big boost. We really turbocharge it. And in doing so, I believe, actually, it will pull the other parts with it as well. I think that when people have the chance to lift their sights above simply surviving day to day, and they have assets of their own, and they have financial independence of their own, that's when they're able to actually start looking around and saying, well, is this the kind of community, the kind of world, the kind of opportunities for me and my family that I'm actually happy about? They can ask themselves some of those broader questions about their lives that they just don't get a chance to even think about when every day is simply a struggle to get through it. So this is about financial independence as much as anything else for girls and women, which is about a rights agenda. But I happen to think it's also much more broad than that. This is about women's economic empowerment, which is not just good for girls and women, it's good for development. I have said 1,000,000 times now, no country can successfully develop sustainably if it leaves half of its population out of that progress. You invest in infrastructure, you invest in education. Well, if only half of your human capital gets a chance to benefit from it and to help it generate a return for that country, then the investment can only work half as hard and be half as successful. It is vital that women are part of development as well. And I think it's good for business. I think in the end, this is about business having a much broader market, a much broader set of consumers, a much broader set of people that are able to be part of not only its workforce, but its management, its leadership. And I think fundamentally, it's vital for those three things. So it's good for women, it's good for development, and it's good for business. And the challenge with this agenda is just such a broad spectrum across the world of women's empowerment as it stands. There are some countries where even having the chance to have a job is a stretch in and of itself. There are other countries like ours where women are in work, but actually there are still too many glass ceilings, and we still don't see women represented at the most senior levels in enough sectors and around enough board tables in our country, although we've made significant progress. So there's a breadth to this that's a real challenge, but we have to somehow, through this work on the panel, find a way through all of that. And I think for me, you just talked about, I think politics works at its best when it works with the grain of human nature. And I think this panel can be powerful because it's working with the grain of human nature, which is actually women want to play a role too. And they should have that chance and that choice to be able to do that wherever they are in our world. This panel, to me, is a huge opportunity. It's the biggest opportunity I think we've had to really push women's empowerment, economic empowerment forward. We have a comparatively short time frame ahead of us to produce a report in time for the United Nations General Assembly and the Secretary General who set up this panel in September. What I want to see and why we want to do this outreach is this needs to be a report not about the problems but about what the solutions are. And it needs to be more than just a list of things that can help this thing be tackled, women's economic empowerment. It needs to be a proper strategy. So yes, it needs to be a map, but it needs to set out how all the things relate to one another and then how we steer our way through to really having a step change on improving women's economic empowerment. We've got all the right people on the panel, but this outreach needs to reflect that. So it needs to reflect what governments need to do and reach out to those people. It needs to reflect what civil society can do and reach out to civil society. It needs critically to reflect on what business can do using its transformative, not only its network, but its capital and its finance clout that it can bring, and reach out to business. We need to reach out to those other transformational networks like the World Bank and the IMF, and it's fantastic that both Jim Kim and Christine Lagarde are on the panel as well. So we've got the right people. We just now need to use this opportunity, and today is part of that because we have all been tasked with doing outreach around the world. And of course, for me, that meant being here in Europe and certainly here in my own country, running this meeting, which is really important for us to hear from you as much as anything else about what you feel needs to be on the agenda, but also critically what you think some of the key solutions might be that we should be focusing on and looking at. And the key thing for me, finally, is scale. I think there are lots of great ideas out there, but the question is, what can we do at scale that's really going to shift women's prospects in the future and quickly as well? This needs to be a very practical report that we come out with in the end. Lots of people have mentioned lots of things. Partly it's about how can we have more and better jobs. Partly it's about how can we make the informal sector really work more financially for women. Partly it's about access to any of those opportunities on employment and livelihoods and removing some of the barriers that hold women back from accessing them. We've mentioned unpaid care, but that's one of the things, not all of the list. So there's a huge agenda to look at. But with your help, I really do think we just have this once-in-a-generation opportunity to pull together all of this work, all of this thinking, and really look at it in the round and say, what's it going to take to shift the dial on this women's economic empowerment? So that's our exam question. No one else is going to fix this. So there isn't some other version of planet Earth where there's another group of people who's going to work their way through it. It might be some of the ideas and some of the discussion in the room that we have today that might be the pivotal moment that particularly shapes the report. So let's take the responsibility for trying to actually make sure that this is a historic report that has a historic impact in the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justine. Now, I'm just going to ask our panel members a few little questions so you get a flavour of what their interests are and what they do, which will hopefully allow you to know how to direct your questions. I'm going to talk first to Fiza, who is the Chief Executive of the Bush Foundation. Now, you are pioneering Pakistan's clean energy. It's quite an innovative project. Do tell us just a little bit about that. But you're also one of Pakistan's leading businesswomen, and this is noticeable in the fact there aren't that many businesswomen. Pakistan is essentially a kind of two-tier society, but business is not where the top tier go. They go into government, they go into structured roles. Can you talk about what's going on at that top level as well?
Sure. So, firstly, thank you all for coming, and it's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to talk to all of you and get your insights and questions. Just to establish a little context for Pakistan first, Pakistan is a country with 26% of female labor force participation, which is the second lowest in the world. And out of this 26%, 32% of the women have a college degree, which means they are at least, they have the potential to be on a senior position of management or a government level job or set up a company or entrepreneurship. Out of that 32%, 12% of the women are employed in the urban sector. And out of that 12%, we're just going down the tier here, 1.2% of the women are in senior level positions. And that too, only in very conventional industries of fashion, retail, marketing, consumer products. It became a coincidence how I sort of took on the lead with a very non-conventional sector of energy in the private business, being not just a woman, but being a young woman. And today, there are only 2 women that are leading energy companies in Pakistan. One is myself, and there's another one in the public sector. And usually, there's only me in a room full of 200, 500 men. And this is not just in Pakistan. We were recently at a delegation with the Denmark delegation, and there were 30 companies from Denmark and Pakistan in energy, and I was the only woman in that entire delegation. So that gave me the first-time perspective that this problem of women leading non-conventional sectors like energy is not just for Pakistan, but it's a global problem that we need to tackle. Now, for me, the main reason behind this to be a problem, there's no one main reason. We all know it's a multi-dimensional, multi-layered, very complex problem. But the top 3 that I can sort of filter out would be lack of economic opportunities that Claire just mentioned, Justin just mentioned. So lack of economic opportunities in both the private sector and the public sector, which has a multi-tiered problem structured within itself. The second would be primarily the stereotypes and the conventional norms and mindsets of people, especially from where I come from, especially from South Asia and Pakistan, where women are supposed to play a specific role of being a caretaker, of being a mother, of being a daughter-in-law, a daughter, and not entirely thinking about her as a professional, having her own dreams, where there is a compromise in other domains of life. And third would be the lack of role models and the lack of mentors, real-life people. And now where I'm sitting here at the UN high-level panel, I'm trying to achieve 2 things. One, to be able to actually create a tangible action for the rest of the women in Pakistan through my role here as a UN high-level panelist. And second, to be able to motivate, influence, and mentor more women to take up and follow their dreams like I did. I did it by coincidence, but I think if more mentoring and counseling happens and women would actually start taking a stand for themselves, which I think is the main solution to all the problems that exist.
I think also one of the other curiosities, essentially, you're in the new section of the energy industry. The old section is obviously dominated by miners drillers and a really male workforce who gradually work their way up through the system. So you've broken it by actually finding an innovation, which ultimately is also good for environmental concerns.
And we had to get an approval, I must add this. When I was becoming the CEO of Bush Foundation, we actually had to get a special approval by the State Bank of Pakistan to allow a young woman to be the CEO. Yes.
Extraordinary.
Because they had a minimum criteria of 15 years of work experience and a grey-haired man. So
Okay, let's move on to Tina, who has many accolades to her name. She's cited as one of the top 100 most influential women in finance, and 40 women to watch when you joined Citi. Now, Tina's unusual in that she comes in as an analyst into a banking institution and essentially analyses data and feeds them information which hopefully influences decisions. Can we talk a little bit about the finance sector and why that should be involved with the conversation about women's economic empowerment, and indeed how deeply women are involved in the finance sector?
Well, there's so many ways to answer that question, but I feel so sorry for myself coming after Faiza, who is my hero and is this incredibly trailblazing, groundbreaking person. But I can add a little bit about how when you are different and when you stand out to start with, you can feel sorry for yourself about that, or you can just decide everyone's going to remember you every room you're in and every time you speak. And that's what I decided to do, and it's worked out pretty well. In my day job at Citi, I'm the first and only chief global political analyst working for a major financial institution. I'm not a gender specialist, but I came down this road when I was asked, please can you write something about women? Now, I wouldn't like to say it was because I was one of the only ones they had, but I thought, write something about women. And we were just coming out of the worst of the financial crisis, and I heard a woman speak who was Hillary Clinton's first chief ambassador to women, and that's Melanie Verveer. And she gave a talk that I heard at Oxford about how if you were to increase the rates of female labor force participation, the effect would be greater than that of rising China and India combined. Now, in my world, in banking, that's astonishing. And I said, if this is true, why isn't everybody talking about it? So what I did was hire my friend who worked for Hillary Clinton as the first chief economist. Lots of firsts, you'll notice. When you're the first, you don't have anything to live up to. This is highly recommended way of going. You can establish the benchmark. So Heidi Kriebel-Redeker and I wrote this report, Women in the Global Economy, Global Growth Generators. And it's a very macro report in Citi's kind of a white paper format. But it wasn't actually the writing of the paper that moved me and inspired me so much. It was when I took it around the world, hosting panels in a lot of different markets, from Japan, where they are in a panic about increasing female labor force participation, because if you have demographic challenges that Japan does and you don't like immigration, getting your female labor force to work is an imperative. To the United States, where I had almost no men come to our talk, as opposed to in Japan, where it was about half. I did it in the Middle East and in many places. And by the end of it, I realized that there is huge interest from the private sector, both in terms of women working in the industry, but also from companies. For investors, I think it will take longer to feed through, to be honest, because it's more abstract. But if you are a fast-moving consumer goods company, women are your main clients, and they are way ahead, in fact, of others in understanding women as consumers, women as people. So I realized that the opportunity is huge, and we are now, within Citi Research, taking on gender economics as one of our mainstream research topics, which means in addition to covering the UK referendum, the US elections, and all the stuff I do in my day job, I've got to come up with a successor report to this. But it has been a very fruitful kind of seam of our research, so there'll be more of that. So at the institution level, on the research side, we can cover this from an analytical, technical perspective that focuses on the implications. What if we closed the gap? What if we closed it by this much? What would translate into for different countries? That is not very easy, by the way, as Alicia knows. She is at the forefront of a very difficult discipline, which has been a microeconomic topic. So to translate that into the macro space requires creativity and a different way of thinking. You wouldn't find the U.S. Treasury thinking about the U.S. budget with a gender lens. And if you ask them the gender impact, they wouldn't be able to tell you. You are changing that here, and I think the UK can really lead the way. So I was hugely inspired. I'm taking a long time to answer your question.
You are.
But don't worry, I'm getting there. This is why I'm sitting here. At the institution level, banks like Citi are working on financial inclusion. I think that in the panel could help Sudi and the others that are doing this to think about gender-based financial inclusion, because they're already doing this. We've kind of had an evolution from microfinance, which still goes on, of course, to the financial inclusion agenda, and that also is a post-financial crisis imperative. So what I have found is great receptivity to doing this, but a request for how to do it. How do we do this, and what are the best ways of doing it?
Okay, and on that point, I'm going to hand you over to Alicia, who is a leading Mexican economist. She's been president of the International Association of Feminist Economists. Now, some people have been saying the high-level panel can only really have any real impact if governments take it seriously. And to date, government action has been a sort of little bit of this is a perennial problem. How do you do it? What do you do? How do you get into the government psyche and start fiddling with things?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here and to talk about our experience. Well, the first point is that public policies are very related with women economic empowerment. There's a fabulous report that made Foro Economic Davos in 2006 about the global gender gap. And when I came from the financial issues, and then I always said that I have to confess that I arrived to the gender issues, but because we were seeing how the financial crisis, especially the banking crisis in Mexico, the effect that it has in women. So when we see all these austerity policies that we have had in Mexico, especially because Mexico has been the best student of all these austerity policies. We saw how especially the public, for example, the budget, the social budget, has been reduced during the 80s, especially in education, in health, and in living. What happened is that we have a very huge problems in the family and in the microeconomic level. So the policies, especially economic policies, are in the middle of this macroeconomic, how does the macroeconomic works, and the microeconomic level. So in the mesoeconomic, who was very difficult for me to understand these public policies, because everybody talks about public policies, the public policies, and then, how they are inserted. All the decisions that you have in the financial markets, and especially the effect that they have in the macroeconomic, are immediately, the effect is in the microeconomic, and especially in the households and in the families. So with the public policies is like the principal hand of the state to manage all the social problems that you have. When you have austerity problems and when you reduce the employment in the public sector, you are going to reduce the consume, and you are going to reduce also the profits of the entrepreneurs, because nobody is going to consume. Or what happened? You are going to have a huge amount of many people, or young people, and very well-educated people that has to migrate to other countries because they have to find a job. And the other thing that it is very important, that most of these jobs, when you don't find a job or you have a very poor education and you don't have an employment, most of those people, and especially young people, goes to not only informal economy, but also to the narco-economic. So this is real huge, and the government and the states has to be aware of what we are doing with our economic policies, especially because most of the policies, the public policies, are approved in the parliament. And so that is very, very important, because we, in democratic regime, we elect our people that are in the parliament, but most of the time they don't see these close relations with the macroeconomic and the microeconomic. So we want to have more women economic empowerment, and women economic empowerment is really very important, because you are going to be you are going to have proper employment, a better income, and then you are going to be also to have better income for your family. So I think public policies is very important, and it is very related with the central bank policy. Not only why the central policy, because it is the employment of last resort. From a heterodox view, the central bank is the employment of last resort. And this has to be in the middle of these public policies. And I think that we have to be aware of what's going in the global economy. It's after 7 years or 8 years, almost a decade of the financial crisis. We are not having growth, we are not having development, and that is a real problem.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. And so we've now got some rather broad perspectives, both from the practicing government level, from the economist's critique of the government, from business itself, and from a more macro level as to how business and finance can work together. And this is the point at which we open it out to the audience, both the physical audience here and the digital audience. And the broad question is that in your experience, what will make a real difference to women's economic empowerment? And I'd quite like you to take on Justine Greening's point about the idea that there are a lot of individual ideas, but how do we take ideas to scale? How does it become a kind of broad enough thing to actually implement change? I'm going to invite you to ask questions. I'd really like you to keep them down to 30, 45 seconds so we can have as many as possible. So make sure that you've thought your question through from beginning to end before opening your mouth. And can you please state your name and your organisation at the beginning of the question so we know how to identify you, and also to thank you for your brilliant interjections and ideas at the end of it. We've also got online viewers. I'm hoping the technology is working. If not, you might see a bit of scurrying around. So first of all, can I take some questions from this room? Now, don't be shy at all. We have a question. It's always the men who put their hands up first. 3 men. I'm going to start over here with just behind you, actually.